welcome as you're arriving. We're just going to give folks a minute or so to pour in.
Oh, thank you, Kathy. First of all, just welcome to everyone from all over the world who is coming and being here with us. We're so delighted to have Daniel Siegel with us. Welcome to everyone from all over the world who is coming and being here with us. We're so delighted to have Daniel Siegel with us. Dr. Siegel has done many things, and I have personally followed him around the world and seen him speak in many different countries. He's the clinical professor of psychiatry at the UCLA School of Medicine and founding co-director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA. He's the executive director of the MindSight Institute, which focuses on the development of MindSight, teaches insight, empathy, and integration in individuals, families, and communities. And he's published a lot of wonderful books. And one of my personal favorites is The Developing Mind, which I used for a couple of years as a textbook when I was teaching at a midwifery college in Portland, Oregon. And he's done a lot of things about parenting and the impact of trauma on parenting that have been hugely helpful for many people that I know trying to find their way through the parenting maze with the after effects of trauma. You can go to his website to find all kinds of amazing classes that he's still offering. He's quite a resource for us. That's a little bit of the public introduction, but I also wanted to say a few words about his importance to me and to the development of this work. When I discovered Daniel Siegel, it was the first time that somebody said, we can change each other's brains. We can make each other's brains good places to live with warmth and resonance and relationship and attunement. And his work became, together with Bonnie Badenoch's work, foundational for all of the journey that we've all been on together of beginning to think about how do we talk to each other and how does language change us? So we invited him here to speak about relationship and how it changes us. So Daniel Siegel, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Sarah. It's an honor to be here, and thanks for inviting me to be with your community. You know, it's really a joy to see people from all over the world saying hello to each other, and being here with you is really an honor. So thank you very much. You know, at the MindSight Institute where I work, before any of us offer, you know, a conversation and a way to connect, we like to say that, you know, we are committed to creating a safer and more supportive learning environment and experience. And we'd like to always start with a reminder that we all have implicit bias, and ask that everyone please be respectful of our inclusive community of a learning culture. If anything occurs during this time in my presentation with you that makes you or anyone else feel unsafe, unheard, or otherwise uncomfortable at any point, please email Christy at admin@mindsightinstitute.com, And just let us know what your experience is so we can make sure we're always in a learning way of connecting with each other. I'm speaking to you here from the unceded lands of the Chumash and the Tongva in what's now called Southern California. And I want to honor the deep wisdom of those indigenous peoples who used to be the stewards of this land. And I want to thank you for really being here to talk about resonance and for taking the time to be a part of this joining. What I'd like to do in these few minutes of giving you kind of just an overview of some ideas and then open up for discussion with Sarah and questions are to say that, you know, on our planet at this moment, we have so many challenges that are facing us. At this very moment, of course, we have a huge displacement and destruction of people in Ukraine. And I want to just take a moment of silence to really feel, as a human family, the pain that is being created by members of our human family. In whatever ways we can offer support in compassionate action, we need to begin with our own inner life. And that's really going to be the topic, whether we're facing war like we are facing now in our human family, or facing the pandemic of a virus that's going out and shutting lives down, literally lives and livelihoods down for our human family. And the social injustice that we see and racism around the world, and the pandemic of environmental destruction, where we're now facing, as the United Nations has told us over and over again, and the recent report just saying it's accelerated even more. These pandemics, including the climate crisis, can be actually all thought of as related to the topic of this gathering, that the way the human mind constructs the experience of self and the related processes of identity and belonging, and that's what we'll be talking about today, those three things: self, identity, and belonging. The way the human mind constructs those things certainly makes it harder to deal with these pandemics, but I want to suggest to you, it's really creating these pandemics. And the way forward for us to deal with all these challenges of our modern lives is actually to take a deep breath and say, how has the human mind done this? And then what can we do to actually, around this planet, as all of us are here now representing, to do something to make a difference? I was told a startling statistic that since 1970, when some of us may have already been born, but many of us may not have even been born yet, over 2/3 of the species that existed before 1970 are now extinct. Now, when the child part of me just feels into that finding of the loss of biodiversity, and even just the other day, I brought some friends and a niece and nephew to the tide pools here in Southern California. I remember going there as a child and seeing an abundance of animals and plants living in the tide pools. And now there was basically nothing. This can be seen as the way the human mind has constructed a self that's separate, that sees itself somehow as not a part of nature, and that what the mind constructs in terms of the meaning of life and what to do with our lives and how to behave in the world treats Earth like a trash can, not like an extension of our collective body. So in the work that has consumed me for over 30 years now, that has the name Interpersonal Neurobiology, which basically just says, how do we take the betweenness, the inter, and the withinness, the personal, and then look at how to bring, initially it was science, but now it's all ways of knowing. So indigenous teachings, the wisdom from our ancient elders who, through the oral tradition, have passed on deep ways of understanding the nature of reality. Contemplative wisdom from practices that are also thousands of years old, that have been from meditative practices, and taken these together with other ways of looking at dance and music and poetry and saying, how do we as human beings come to understand the nature of reality? And then adding that, if we can, to Western-based science that has a certain kind of approach to understanding reality. And when you do all that and find the common ground, a term called consilience is what we find. And so from a conceptual point of view, what I'm going to describe to you is a consilient view that takes all these different approaches, indigenous teachings, contemplative wisdom, and Western-based science, and says, is there a common ground? And I'm going to offer you just some take-home messages. There's a book that I've just completed called Intra-Connected that walks you through the science and the developmental aspects of this. But let me just give you the take-home messages that emerge from that deep exploration, and then we can have a discussion about it and really explore that. So what we're going to do then is look at things that may seem very brief, the way I'm going to summarize these, but they're I think take-home points that may best resonate with everyone around the world. Someone is asking in the chat, and I've learned from my kids to multitask. So I've noticed something says it would be helpful if I would acknowledge the profound impact of sexism. Absolutely. So we can see how people are marginalized by gender orientation, by gender identity, by race, which is a construction, by culture. We're even seeing it by nationality. So thank you for that. And I'm going to try not to look at the chat, but that was a very important thing. And actually, if something does come up, someone flag me or Sarah wave to me because I can see your beautiful image there. And people are saying, please acknowledge both sides of the suffering in Russia and the Ukrainian people. Absolutely. And we could spend a long time of that. And I do acknowledge that. And in fact, that's a part of what we're going to dive into now, is to say, what is the self and what is the way forward from this consilient approach. So the first thing to say is, from combining a bunch of sciences together, three things are often talked about when we say the word self. And Sarah knows, and some of you who may have read some of my things know, I have an addiction to acronyms. So my apology if English isn't your first language and these acronyms don't make sense. But the first acronym is a simple one, but it's the three things that science talks about as the characteristics of what we mean by self. And the first is sensation or subjective experience. The second is a perspective. So sensation and subjective experience, those would be the felt texture of life. The perspective is like looking through your glasses, or you're looking from your point of view. And the third is agency. How do you act and have a sense of will and intention? So these spell the word spa. So this would be the spa of the self, and maybe spa is an international world. I don't know word. So it's a natural thing in modern culture to get a message that the self, who you are, happens inside your body. You could even get it more restricted if you are, in medicine, for example, like I'm a physician, and since the time of Hippocrates said all of our joys and sorrows come from the brain and the head, and then in William James, the grandfather of modern psychology, essentially repeated that and said, yes, that's where everything comes from, your brain and your head. So it's understandable with those messages from 2,500 years ago in the case of Hippocrates, 125 years ago in the case of William James. We now have kind of a view, yeah, the self is in the body, and even psychotherapy has been focusing on, the development of the self, self-actualization, self-compassion, self this, self that, where the word self is often meant as the individual within the skin and case body. So you may even be hearing me say this and say, well, why did Sarah ask Dan to come here? Because that's so obvious. Why is he saying the obvious? Well, what I'm going to suggest to you is that common modern belief, if it's thought of as the only source of self, let's just name that the solo self that comes from the individual body, there's all sorts of outcomes of that view. And what I want to suggest to you is that when you go deeper into sensation, perspective, and agency, there's no reason it needs to be limited to the skin and case body, certainly not to the head. So in all the writings I've done on the mind, I've tried to point out that the mind is at least fully embodied, not just in skulls, that's number one, but the mind is also fully relational, our connections to people and to nature. So you might say, well, how could a mind be both within the body and between the body and the world? And that's where looking at something called energy and its subset information, energy and information as they change, called flow. Energy and information flow is not limited by skull or skin. And that's where the notion of resonance comes in, because when you look at, let's say, processes that are relational, like attachment relationships, which I am trained in being a researcher in that, you can talk about the resonance in which two individuals can be differentiated, but then become linked. And the key thing about what we're going to talk about, in the linkage, they don't lose the differentiation. Like each evening, and I see Sarah has a cello there, I play guitar each evening, the strings, 6 strings of a guitar, they resonate with each other. They don't become each other. When I pluck one string, it influences the frequency of another string, depending on where my fingers are on the fretboard. But as I do that, they are joining with each other to become what we're going to name as integrated. So they're integrated together, where we're going to define integration as differentiated aspects of a system become linked without losing their differentiation. So it's not like blending. It's not like a smoothie. Resonance is a synergy. It's where the whole is greater than the individual parts. And this also has the quality of what's called emergence. And it's certainly related to Gregory Bateson's view of, these unfolding aspects of our relationality, and beautiful work of Gregory Bateson. And I can feel even the resonance as people write in the chats, and I'm trying not to look at the chats, but it's, I would much prefer to be in person with you, and we'd do this together. As I mentioned to Sarah, why don't we just do this as a conversation? So the first thing to say then is self, the subjective experience, the perspective, the agency. In modern culture, you're told it's alone. And what that does is it creates a separation that is not only, I think, the cause of these pandemics that we've named, but it's also a source of depression and despair. It's a source of addiction. This disconnection leads to addiction. And it's a deep source of feeling like there's no hope. And in our world, the attachment research world, we have a phrase, epistemic trust, where you come to trust that the nature of reality being told to you by your caregivers is accurate and true. What I want to say is, for modern culture, I think there's a deep unsettled feeling because it's a violation of epistemic trust to be told the self is separate. But it's said all over our planet now. I once said, oh, this is the Western view, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who I was fortunate to be able to teach with, he said, don't call it Western. It's all over the planet now. So stop saying Western. And my son was with me and he said, the Dalai Lama got you, and so I don't say Western anymore, but let's call it modern view. And this modern view has taken over Earth, sadly. So what can we do about it? Well, let's look at the second feature, identity. Identity are the features that you use literally to identify what the self is, right? And this goes in two ways. Identification allows you to say, I'm this or that. And someone brought up sexism. You could say, I'm male, I'm female, I'm neither of those. That would be my identity. No matter what my body might be, I could have a different gender identity. It also would determine then the next thing we'll talk about, which is belonging. Based on the lens of identity that I use, I would say I am a part of this body. And with people who've been traumatized, for example, we have been so mistreated by our caregivers that we actually don't feel like we belong to our body in a process of dissociation. And that's a whole nother conversation we can have. But the issue of belonging is not just relational from the outside world, it's also relational in the inside world. So belonging is a feeling of trust, of wholeness, of membership. Identity has a lens to it that we can adjust. And here's, I think, the path forward. So in a month's time, I'll be speaking to a gathering of some process related to the United Nations. You're all welcome to come. It's called the Inner Development Goals. It'll be held in Sweden, and I'll be presenting online. But the gathering will be members of the United Nations who are looking at how we are not moving it forward in any significant way, or in any timely way for sure, toward the 2030 sustainability goals that the United Nations has set up. So it's a pretty dismal report card we're getting as a human family. So a group in Sweden got together and said, let's work on why we're having such a hard time working on this. And this group, is looking at the inner side. There's another group in the Mindfulness Initiative led by Jamie Bristow that's doing a very, very similar thing, actually. And you can look them up. Just look up Mindful Initiative head by Jamie Bristow, Bristow. But these two groups are both working on the inner side of the climate crisis. And I say this to you because this issue of what can we do, when we look at an identity lens, what you're able to say from a scientific point of view is that the human mind has the capacity to adjust the way it constructs identity. And let's just call it like a lens, like a camera. So just like right now, let's do a little, practice. If you put your hand in front, if you're physically able to do that, take a look at your thumb, right? You can really focus in on your thumb. Look at that thumbnail. It's been with you your whole life. It's just an amazing thing. And it's opposable, meaning it can go to the different fingers if we're able to do that, right? So look at that thumb. You can really focus in on that thumb. Now, if your identity were just the thumb, you'd say, yeah, I'm a thumb. So cool, so great. And you would be cool and great. Yet, if we look at it, you're a part of a hand. Oh my God, look, there's 4 other digits on that hand, right? So you go, oh my God, I'm a thumb, but I'm also a hand. Well, that's amazing. And so my thumbness doesn't go away when I become a woven part of a hand. And then you go, well, hold on, I can widen my lens even further. And I said, I'm part of an arm. And now I'm part of a whole body. Okay, so my question to you is, why should that lens adjustment stop with the body? So let's try it right now. You can sense your body. Now let's look at the room around you, the space around you. In my case, I can look out on some trees. I've got a puppy over here. I can look at her. I can start widening that to include not just people, but the whole planet. So my subjective sensation, the S of SPA, my perspective, this way I'm adjusting my lens and seeing that, and even how I act on behalf of the greater good for people in Russia, in Ukraine, for people everywhere on the planet, for all living beings on the planet, that's my agency, then my whole sense of self expands. because I'm adjusting a lens. Now, the good news about this is this can happen in a very rapid fashion. And when I become open to that larger identity, then there's a broader belonging that then becomes the way I walk on this planet. And it's not just, oh, I heard Dan and Sarah talk about this, and wasn't that an interesting idea? It becomes an experience. So the sense of self no longer has to be a solo self. It can take its rightful place in the resonance of all living beings, right? And so you don't lose the me, but you realize that the we, the connection to other people and to all of nature, are both there. And so the way we like to summarize that is me plus we equals mwe, MWE. And we're trying to collect that in every language on the planet. So if you want to write to Christy at Mindsight Institute and give us your version in your language, because I know there are people from all over the world, to get a sense of what does it mean in your language to have a word that says, here's the inner skin encased me, and yet here's the relational we, and who I am, myself, my identity, my belonging is a we. Then that would really bring up this thing that I'll conclude my talk with, which is, I once was given the opportunity to go on a trip, and the trip involved 2 steps to it that were independent, but they happened at the same sequence of the calendar. One was I went to a place called the Pandopopulous Forest in Utah, and 50 people from different religions and me, I'm not from a religion, but I'm from interpersonal neurobiology. We went on this bus, and it was a 7-hour trip, and we got to this forest. And in the forest, there are about, I think it's 48,000 trunks of a kind of tree called a quaking aspen tree. And when you look on the surface, it looks like there are 48,000 separate trees. But if you go just 6 inches beneath the surface, you find a common root ball. And when you test the DNA of these trunks, you come to discover it's one organism. And that was an incredible example. We did a meditative practice I do called the Wheel of Awareness. You're welcome to come to our website and do it, where you learn in the hub of this wheel, where you have pure awareness, the rim are the things you're aware of, to drop into the hub and feel the expansiveness of consciousness that allows you to feel connected, this open awareness and love. And as you do that, you have what the naturalist there in the forest said, this is exactly the feeling that the forest represents, that we are actually all connected and all filled with love. So I've done that practice with now tens of thousands of people, and that's what people experience in the hub of that wheel, pure awareness as connection, open awareness, and love. This deep sense of resonance emerges from there because in the book Aware, I talk about this in depth, but here I'll just give you a sentence that when you drop into this space, you get what indigenous teachings have been teaching for thousands of years, what contemplative teachings have been teaching for thousands of years, and that in Western science, we now have a possible explanation, but we have these 2 realms that quantum physics has demonstrated, that one is large objects like Isaac Newton studied, that 350 years ago, he came up with these properties that are called Newtonian physics or classical physics. But then there's another realm that is in the small objects like an electron or a photon that we study now with quantum physics. This microstate realm has very different properties. So when I, in the second phase of that trip, went to study indigenous teachings and meditative practices with John P. Milton up in the forest in Colorado, and then we spent 3 days by ourselves, all the participants. When I came out of that experience of being in the forest, the word I tried to share with everyone was not interconnected, which is so often used, because interconnected is a word that implies I'm here, you're there, and we're connected with each other, which is beautiful, but it wasn't the feeling in the forest for this body. The feeling in the forest was there was a wholeness to everything. So I just said to the group, well, I just felt intra-connected. So I went back and said, okay, I want to try to write this experience. So every time I would write intra-connected, the word processor would correct it to interconnected. And then I found out it's not a word. So intra-connected is the name of this book, and intra-connected is a word we need in our modern lives that really says there is a me, there is a we, and the intraconnected whole is how we resonate and allow this process of integration, which is basically flourishing, to arise. And when we're blocked because we've been traumatized in various ways, or society is marginalizing us, there are ways that we get shrunken in ourselves. Our identity lens is constricted, our belonging becomes very tight, and we get what Einstein called an optical delusion, a false belief of our consciousness that we're actually separated. So intraconnected for me is a way we can embrace this notion that integration allows this synergy to arise, that there's an emergence that comes with resonance, that when we let go and let this process unfold based on some issues of the mathematics of complex systems, there's a natural emergence of integration, that we don't need anyone to tell us to integrate. We don't need to have someone say how nature operates, for example. We have to stop being so differentiated as individuals and as an individual species so we can let nature thrive. Because when integration is made visible, what we like to say at our institute is integration made visible is kindness and compassion. And that's really when we're resonating with the world, that you feel the love, the connection, and the awareness that seem like the three threads of a singular tapestry of life. And that's, I think, the opportunity of moving together as a community, as a human family, to realize we're a part of the family of all living beings. We're siblings in our personal families, we're siblings in our human family, and we're siblings in the family of all living beings. So thank you so much. That's my brief overview of interconnected and what an integrated self-identity and belonging might look like. There's so much more to share, and I'm looking forward to our discussion together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you and to hear it in person. I have some questions, and some of them come from older things that you've published that you may have changed your view on since the time that they were published. So just give us the update if that's what's here for us.
Sure.
Early on, you wrote about positive and negative feelings, and you would say that when we were moving towards chaos or rigidity, we would be feeling negative feelings. So I just want to stop and see, is that still the way that you hold it, or do you want to update that?
Yeah, what that's referring to is looking for a consilient connection between the interpersonal neurobiology of well-being and looking at the fundamental process of integration as well-being, and then meeting with some people in the field of positive psychology. And in that branch of psychology, they use the terms negative and positive emotions. I actually never use those.
Oh.
Yeah, I don't think they're very helpful, but I'm always looking for bridge building and consilience. So I started working with Barb Fredrickson, who's a wonderful researcher, who is a positive psychology and social psychologist as well. And so when I looked at the research in the broad field, even though they don't talk about integration, when I looked at their research findings and talked to Barb Fredrickson about it, then it seemed like what they call negative emotions, I don't use that term, but you're basically quoting, I think, from The Developing Mind, where I said, well, here's what this feels, because I'm trying to look for bridges to bring everybody together. I said, when they say positive emotions, it increases in integration, so it leads more to harmony. When they use the term negative emotions, which they use, it's a decrease in integration. And when you shut down integration, if it shuts down too much, you go to chaos or rigidity. And I still stand by that. Yeah. And it doesn't feel good. So that's, it's not a feel good emotion.
and you may not know this then, but one of the things that we discover in this work, and that seemed like a part of what you were talking about, was the importance of being able to acknowledge mourning, being able to acknowledge sadness. Are these, do you have a sense that sadness and mourning, when they're acknowledged and accompanied with resonance, move us toward integration?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, you know, when you look at, there's so much to say about that. So let me unpack it a bit without getting too weird. When you look at energy and how physicists define energy as the movement from possibility to actuality. And I know that can be weird. And I've written 100 pages on that one sentence in the book Aware. So I know it's strange, but when you look at it that way and apply the physics of energy to both brain function and relationship function, you begin to realize that they're consilient. That is, when you've taken all the possibilities that exist and start limiting them, let's say with trauma, and developmental trauma would include abuse or neglect, then that constriction of possibility can lead to both direct impacts on the individual, and they can also lead to adaptations to try to survive, which also impact individuals. So those two things, you have the direct experience, and then you have your attempt to do the best you can. So when I was teaching in Australia, for example, Martin Teicher, who's this wonderful researcher you'll be meeting soon, he and I went for a long walk, and, he has so importantly discovered that the main impact of developmental trauma, that is abuse and neglect, are to impair the growth of integration in the brain in areas that we can name the corpus callosum, linking left and right, the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, and the connectome. And he'll show you scans of all these, I'm sure. The issue I want to point out is that developmental trauma is where resonance is impaired, that is, integration is impaired in a relationship. So in neglect, there's excessive differentiation. The kid is just left by herself or himself. In abuse, there's too much linkage and there's no differentiation. If I'm the abusive parent, I'm going to intrude my sexual needs onto a child and not differentiate. This child should not be having that experience. So impairments to attachment relationships, the extreme being developmental trauma, are impairments to relational integration. So the energy and information flow, instead of being full of possibility, gets narrowed down because it's leading to these non-integrated states. It's not resonance, see? So amazingly, when relational integration is not present, neural integration doesn't grow. And the opposite is true. When relational integration is there, we call it secure attachment, and neural integration grows. So this is where the resonance of energy and information flow that's relational becomes energy and information flow inside the skin encased body that is integrated. But what happens when that happens is where attention goes, neural firing flows, and neural connection grows, you start growing integration inside the body. So the skull and skin don't block this resonance process. And that's where, in terms of your question about acknowledging things, this capacity to get in touch with the sadness and the mourning that you're talking about is a way to allow the nervous system to say, here's a framework of direct experience I've had and adaptation to that experience. And now I'm trying to create a new pathway forward. But to do that, I'm nervous saying the word must, but I think the clinical support is there for that. You really need to learn these skills of, I don't like the word self-regulation or self-compassion because it implies self is in the body alone.
Right.
So I call it inner compassion and inner regulation, so that your inter self can become more an intra self, the inner and the inter. So the idea of acknowledgement and mourning is, I can go in the hub of my wheel, to use that metaphor, and say, I am open to anything coming up on the rim, anything at all. But to do that, I need to do the work. And I wrote a book with Mary Hartzell called Parenting from the Inside Out,
Mhm.
which some people say should have been just called, healing from the inside out. But it takes you through these steps of how to go from non-secure attachment to secure attachment as an adult.
Yes.
So yeah, so that's, does that address that, Sarah?
It does. It does. You had said that there were a lot of things to say about sadness and mourning. So just if we'll just take it's so key for me, especially in the context that you were bringing forward of our world and all the conflicts, and of course the climate crisis and the loss of species. Do you want to say anything? You may not, but do you want to say anything about the way in which being able to name mourning moves us toward integration?
Yeah, I mean, in the book Aware, you'll see, and actually in the third edition of The Developing Mind, if you want to go deep in a 500-page science book,
I love that.
you'll see a proposal that the mind is emerging as energy goes along this pathway from openness and what we call the plane of possibility upward towards higher states of probability, which we call plateaus, and then particular peaks, which are certainties, like a particular thought would be a peak, an emotion would be a peak, a memory would be a peak, but a state of mind would be a plateau. And then in this plane of possibility, the proposal is that is the origin of consciousness. So it's a big statement and we need more research to support it. But so far, it's consistent with indigenous teachings. It's consistent with the contemplative wisdom. It's consistent with looking at a deep view of these 50,000 people that did the Wheel of Awareness. So it's just an interesting proposal. But in terms of this question of mourning, what it means is the individual is able to find this resource of the plane of possibility, which basically is the hub of the wheel. And in that space, they're acknowledging that something actually happened through acknowledging these peaks and these particular states of mind, like dissociative states.
Mm-hmm.
But what they develop is this capacity to tap into the source of love, which is the plane. But here's the tricky thing that I found as a therapist, and also as just an individual, when I've worked on traumas of my own, the plane of possibility, while it's full of the potentiality, it lacks form, and it is maximal uncertainty. So for those of us who've been through trauma, or in the form of abuse or neglect or adversity, the last place we want to be as a kid is with uncertainty.
Yeah.
And yet the proposal here says that maximal uncertainty is the source of awareness, open awareness. So when you see that, the work with a client, the work with ourselves, is to learn to embrace uncertainty, even though it's terrifying at first. We have a plateau preventing us. That's what kept us sane, facing what we faced. But now the healing work is to go into that space of uncertainty. And instead of feeling like you just need to control everything, you let life and let love happen from the inside out. And so this is where the mourning comes in. In many ways, mourning is opening your plane of possibility up to the reality of the pain that happened before.
Yeah.
And you couldn't do the mourning when you were a kid because you would have gone nuts, because you couldn't accept that your caregivers were not reliable. So not mourning then was understandable, but the mourning needs to happen now. And as that, in many ways, mourning is about letting your attachment system readjust. And so you find that the inner sanctuary of uncertainty that before was terrifying now becomes this peaceful place. And I do the Wheel of Awareness every morning. And when you get in the hub, there's a part where you bend the spoke around, you start feeling the incredible, what's the word? Joy, really, and relief that you can trust the universe, that love is the major force of the thread of reality. And when you start living like that, you see things happen, like we face all the pandemics we're facing, but this gives you a deep source of resilience
Yeah.
and resonance.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. The next question is about warmth. And you know, an early thing that you used to talk about a lot was contingent communication, which you talk about less now. But I just wondered about how you perceive warmth as integral, not so important, essential, a side dish. What's your sense on
About warmth or about
Yeah.
contingent communication?
about warmth? About warmth.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Well, I mean, the history in attachment research was that Mary Ainsworth first proposed that parental warmth would be the key to secure attachment, and she was wrong. And she acknowledged that she was wrong, that it was not warmth, but it was sensitivity, which allows contingent communication. So contingent communication is where you do three things. You are tuning in to what's going on in another person. So for a parent, it would be tuning into the inner life of the child. Number two is you take that into yourself and say, ooh, I'm feeling the inner life of Sarah. You know, I wonder what she's going through. And number three, I then give you a timely and effective response, showing that you were inside of me. And you had the experience, as one of my patients one time said so beautifully. I can see her right now. I know her name, but she's my patient, so I can't say her name. But I always want to quote her, feeling felt. And I didn't make up that term, she did. But it's such a beautiful and succinct way of saying what resonance does.
Yes.
You feel felt by the other person. You don't become the other person. So contingent communication allows you to feel felt. And what that does then is you can have someone who's warm and bubbly and everything like that, who doesn't do contingent communication, and they don't develop secure attachment.
No.
So, so this is where Mary Ainsworth was such a pioneer. And she said, and it is compassion, absolutely, where she said the sensitivity allows you, when I had the deep opportunity to have a dinner with Mary Ainsworth and Mary Main in a very noisy restaurant. And I say noisy because the two of them turned toward me and I was between the two of them. So we had 3 hours to just talk about stuff. And, the Marys, we're really talking about mindsight, this term I had made up when I had dropped out of medical school and came back, that parental sensitivity is based on not only the parent's presence, the ability to be present and show up, but the capacity to have an image of the inner mind of the person you're connecting with. I call it mindsight. It's what my medical professors did not show.
Right.
Or maybe they didn't even have it. I don't know.
Right. So then because Bonnie Badenoch talks about warmth being hugely integrative. Does warmth come back around for you after Mary?
Well, let me ask you, Sarah, what does warmth mean?
Well, for me, it means, and one of the things I talk about with resonance is that there's precision, which seems like it comes very much close to the word sensitivity that the Marys were using, but that there's this other element of affection and of welcome and of the appearance of delight in the other.
Interesting. Okay. Well, yeah. So that may be a very specific way of defining warmth that I don't think Mary Ainsworth was defining when she said it. Hers was rather, the delight in another, which she would have called that parental sensitivity. I think. So the warmth, this is, I think, when just going back to my conversation with the Marys, and this is also published years ago, where she acknowledged, I thought it was warmth, I was wrong.
Right.
Yeah. And so what she, but the way I think she would say is that it isn't just the general characteristic of a person, being this warm, smiling person, I think is how Mary Ainsworth would have thought about it. Because those characteristics are not specific to the child, you see. They're just and so you can have a parent who's not particularly bubbly and warm, who's a very securely attached child, because that parent is tuned in and sensitive to what's going on, but they don't exude this personality trait of, warmth. So this was the really interesting thing about a scientist doing this work, is she said, I think it's warmth. Whoops, I was wrong.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean warmth is bad. Now, let's be really clear. It's not like she was wrong, like, ooh, warmth is bad for you. It's just that wasn't the key ingredient. You could have parents who were not warm,
Right.
but were sensitive, and their kids were securely attached to them. And you could have parents who were warm, but not sensitive.
Right. And then there was not secure attachment.
Yeah. So
then let's move to this question of delight. You have this sense that it was present in parental sensitivity. How has delight played a role in your development, in your life, in your exploration?
In my life?
Sure.
Yeah, I think delight is everything. I think let's unpack it a little bit. For me personally, in my relationship with my kids, for example, maybe because of the challenges in my own childhood with my parents, which wasn't easy, I came to parenting, with a lot of energy about not getting what I got or didn't get in my childhood. And then I became a researcher in that area and a therapist in that area. And the idea of earned secure attachment, was what I had to live through in this body. And so the delight I would have in my kids was, just to feel incredible gratitude for them, to feel joy in them, to celebrate, have a feeling of celebration about them as individuals. And then as they grew into their unique individual beings, some of my friends would say, oh, you're spending too much time talking to them about their feelings, but I would take delight in their capacity, basically to have mindsight, to explore their own inner life, to wonder about the inner lives of others. And my friends thought I was just going to make them neurotic, but I think it actually helped them become quite resilient in the paths they took. You can listen to Alex Siegel's music on online and feel what that is. And our daughter's getting her doctoral degree in environmental science, to trying to be a steward protecting the planet, and I just feel so much delight that they follow their own paths, even though their mother and their father, may have been more traditional in, professional pursuits. So that's, I don't know, there's a certain, maybe, there's a certain energy there. And I don't know if that's the same as warmth, as feeling them as differentiated beings and being deeply appreciative, grateful, feeling joy in their becoming. So that's kind of what delight is for me. And certainly warmth doesn't hurt that, but it's yeah. So, and I think, especially if you take Bonnie's view of warmth, which had the feeling, at least in this body, when you said it, of kindness, as we said, kindness and compassion or integration made visible. And that emerges from parental sensitivity, whether you have warmth or not. So you can really feel felt by a parent who's not particularly warm, but is really tuned into you, because that may be more like a temperament feature of the parent. Warmth, but kindness, kindness, compassion. There's lots of ways people with different personalities can show kindness and compassion.
We're moving towards the end, I'm aware, but one of the things that people have been asking about is about power differentials, and what I've been thinking about with receiving these comments is the way in which you had mentioned implicit bias when you very first started to speak. And about the way in which the more power we hold, the less empathetic we are to people who do not have power. And I wondered what your insight was on that.
Well, the work of Dacher Keltner, Keltner, who wrote a really powerful book called The Power Paradox, talks exactly about that. And, a simple experiment gives you a feeling of it. At UC Berkeley, where he works, his students, and maybe in a related lab, but they went on the corner and they just they just watched which cars made a turn that endangered pedestrians.
Mm.
That's all. They just wrote them down. And it turned out there was a direct correlation between the cost of the car and the risking other people's lives.
Yes.
Right. Now there's lots of studies like that, that when you get the power, if you use the word power, is the ability to influence other people.
Yeah.
Is one way of defining power. So that's different than having authority, and that's different, from, just being engaged in the world. So that idea of power often in our society is associated with the money you have.
Yeah.
You have the money, you can buy people's time to do things for you. You can get it. So the expensive car is a sign of a person's income usually. And the sad news is that then the person driving the car is not thinking about the safety of the pedestrian,
Right.
Or if they're in business, the health of the planet,
Right.
or if they're in politics, the larger, the greater good. And you can see a lot of the studies about this if you go to the Greater Good Science Center at Berkeley. Their website is amazing as a source of really very rigorous perspectives on this topic. And I would look at Dacker's book. I'll just say this while we're talking about Dacker. He does some powerful work on awe.
Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, awe is the kind of the opposite to what you're asking about power, that instead of power making you feel you're separate and you can have this influence over the people, you're less compassionate, which it shows. Awe is the experience of feeling overwhelmed a bit when you first expose something like a beautiful forest or, even amazing music or art. There's this feeling of overwhelm. And then when you unpack what actually happens with awe, is you go from a view of yourself as being very separate and, you know exactly what's going on, to I don't know exactly what's going on. There's something really bigger happening here. And initially my sense of self, Dacker would, when we talked together, he said, this is a part of what traditionally has been called self-transcendent emotions, awe, gratitude, and compassion.
Mm-hmm.
So I said to him, well, what if you change that term not to self-transcendent, but self-expanding?
Mm-hmm.
What if instead of getting rid of yourself, you thought that you are the forest,
right,
that you are all of living beings? And he loved that. So these self-expanding emotions, one of them is gratitude.
Yeah.
And Louis Schwartzberg has a beautiful film coming out soon called, I think it's called Gratitude Revealed. Being grateful. Yeah, Gratitude Revealed. The next is the idea of compassion, feeling another person's suffering and finding a way to help. And the third is awe.
Mm-hmm.
And you can go on awe walks that really allow you to resonate with the world, I think.
Mm-hmm.
They allow you to have an expanded sense of self and drop out of your particular ways of thinking, or, and find this larger whole, this intraconnected whole. So, I think that's really what resonance is about, is letting go of a drive to be separate and realizing you are a fundamental part of this integration, this synergy that arises, and letting that love that emerges from that resonance happen is awesome. And so important for us to try to cultivate in this very disconnected world we are living in. And I think there's great hope for, expanding the sense of self, widening that identity lens, and broadening our belonging. So as we move forward, especially in the next, 10 years of life on this planet, that we do this together.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much, Daniel. I'm so grateful that you were with us. Such a pleasure to just have your person here with us.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
As we end, one of the traditions in our community is to have needs met and gifts received shared in the chat. And I wonder if that would be okay with you, Daniel.
Sure. I'm going to turn my chat on and I'm going to watch everybody's chats.
So if you had needs met and gifts received from being here with us, with Daniel Siegel and with Sarah, you can put those into the chat to everybody. how did this move you? How did it touch you? How did it move inside your body? Sarah, if you want to say any words about that, you're welcome.
I'll read some of them aloud just in case people are listening to the recording and don't want to go to the chat, which is also saved and is a part of the classroom for you to be able to access when you
The
want.
chat will be included if you with the package.
With the package. Oh, with the recording package. Thank you. Brenda writes, learning. Melissa writes, hope, community, love. Rana writes, a synergistic awe and more integration of inner and interdependent love. Diane, open to curiosity. Liana, feeling validated for my need for connection. And Catherine writes, need met for expanding my experience of God inside. Lali writes, sweet dialogue between these two who have been such great teachers for me. And glimmers of understanding and hope. Leanne, clarity, learning. Paulina, integrity, connection. Natalie writes, Daniel, I loved the example of the resonance and the guitar. This inner visual picture of an instrument will stick in my mind with what you said about resonance. Thank you for that. Mary writes, need met for hope. I'm excited through and through. Beth, curiosity, hope, openness. Vernilla, inspiration and expansion. Emma, honesty, good intentions, grounding. And there are many, many more. But we've got some read aloud for those of you who are wondering what's happening. Yeah, so beautiful. Daniel, is there anything you'd like to say as we're coming to an end?
Thank you. It's beautiful to be here with you, Sarah. Thank you to your whole community. You know, the work of healing and the work of integration are the same.
Mhm.
And this is all about resonating and finding a path forward collectively. So this interconnected whole is something we can create. We can create it. And I'm so honored to be here with you